ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
Hello, you're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, we take a look at what effect the climate crisis has on the movement of refugees across the world. A shortage of coal leads to a dip in China's carbon emissions. And Pakistan authorities look for ways to reduce emissions as Lahore is named the most polluted city in the world this week. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. The mass movement of refugees into Europe is dominating headlines once again. Many of them are fleeing conflict and persecution in their own countries. But across the world, there is now increasing evidence that climate change is a factor. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre earlier this year said more people were displaced by extreme weather-related disasters in 2020 than by conflict. Just one example, in May this year in Afghanistan, heavy rain and floods triggered an estimated 16,000 displacements across 14 provinces. Bangladesh is one of the most climate-vulnerable countries in the world. It's low-lying and frequently hit by serious storms, such as Cyclone Amphan in 2020. It's predicted that by 2050, 1 in 7 people in Bangladesh will be forced from their homes due to climate change. In the future, we're likely to see more of these displacements. Climate change could displace more than 200 million people within their own country by 2050, according to the World Bank. And while that prediction is for internally displaced people, the conditions created by climate change add to the issue of international migration. Andrew Harper is Special Advisor to the High Commissioner for Climate Action at the UN Refugee Agency. Andrew Harper, thanks very much indeed for being with us. How much do climate events, extreme weather events, impact on migration? Can we identify that? Can we put a number on it?
Well, I think the figures that you mentioned before are particularly valid, and that is last year there was some 30 million people that were displaced due to extreme weather events, and that is one person per second. So if that doesn't grab attention, I don't know what does. But that also doesn't take into account people who have been displaced due to longer-term impacts, such as desertification or sea level rise. But what we're particularly concerned about is how climate change and extreme weather events are complicating already fraught situations. So we've already got tens of millions of people who have been displaced by conflict, but what we're looking at is people being displaced by conflict having their lives made even more challenging, even more vulnerable by the situation of climate change and by extreme weather events. If you look at the situation in South Sudan at the moment, we're talking to colleagues at the moment who are trying to put up earthen walls to protect the camps. We were talking to colleagues in the Sahel who have had to deal with a shortened rain season, and that's going to lead to food insecurity. So across the board, we're seeing the impact of climate change, not necessarily driving people away, but contributing to underlying vulnerabilities, aggravating underlying grievances, and that's causing people to move.
And in your role, Andrew, as you've described, you witnessed this firsthand. Who feels the impacts of this the hardest?
Well, not the people who are probably attending COP26. It's the people who were not there who are being impacted the most, and that's because the people with the least resources, and often the lowest in terms of voice, have got the least capacity to adapt to the impact of climate change. So if you come from a developed world, from like countries with high incomes, then you can change your lifestyle, you can adapt. But if you've got nothing and you're relying on the food that you were able to salvage from last year, and that's get washed away, then what do? So what we're seeing around the world at the moment is extremely vulnerable populations suffering body blow after body blow, and then sort of saying, okay, like, what do we do next? And this is one of the big reasons why there's such a push for support for adaptation and building resilience. People do not want to leave. Despite the impression in the West, people would prefer, if they've got a choice, to remain with their communities. But let's give them that choice. Let's build the resilience. Let's support refugees where they are and the hosts who are so generously providing the protection that they need, and often without that much gratitude or resources.
Andrew Harper, good to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
In some of today's other climate news, China's carbon emissions have fallen for the first time since its economic recovery from the coronavirus began, according to the analysis from the Carbon Brief website. The world's biggest polluter saw CO2 emissions drop by around 0.5% in the third quarter of 2021 compared to a year earlier. The drop is partly as a result of a clampdown on property development and widespread coal shortages. Water companies in England and Wales issued more than 5,500 alerts of sewage being discharged into coastal waters in the last year. That's according to a report from Surfers Against Sewage, who say the pollution is a result of storm overflows. The UK government has handed the oil and gas industry £13.6 billion in subsidies since the landmark Paris Climate Accord was signed in 2015, according to analysis by campaign group Paid to Pollute. If approved, the Cambo oil field, northwest of the Shetland Isles, could also benefit from tax breaks and payments towards decommissioning costs. Environmentalists argue that the oil field is incompatible with the Paris Agreement targets and shouldn't go ahead. The results are in from this year's Great British Beach Clean, and they're looking positive. More than 5 tonnes of litter was collected by dedicated volunteers who recorded an average of 385 items on each beach, dropping from 425 in 2020. The amount of litter collected is the lowest recorded yet, although 75% of the rubbish was plastic. Last week, we reported on air pollution levels in Delhi, which had reached such high levels that authorities were forced to close down some coal-fired power stations. Now, the Pakistani authorities are sending anti-smog squads to track down the biggest polluters in Lahore, which has been top of the list of the world's most polluted cities this week. I asked Dr. Asif Khattak, Assistant Professor of Environmental Sciences at the University of Peshawar in Pakistan, about the scale of the problem.
We do have air pollution problems in Pakistan, and the reason why Lahore is experiencing a very thick smog for the last couple of weeks is because of the uncontrolled pollution. And we have a lot of vehicle emissions which are actually contributing to the smog. So during the winter season, there's a lot of condensation in the lower atmosphere, due to which we have the fog being produced. So when the smoke from the vehicles and the industries and the nearby brick kilns, it combines with the fog, then the smog is produced.
What impact does that smog have on the residents of Lahore?
So the main impacts are health impacts, which we can see being directly influencing the residents of Lahore. For example, those patients who already have asthma, their asthma, it becomes more severe, or if they have COPD, that can become severe. But we also see those residents who do not have any underlying health conditions who can also suffer. For example, eye irritation, throat irritation. This is very common as a result of the smog. So it has direct impacts on the human health.
And frighteningly, serious impacts on life expectancy.
Oh, absolutely, yes. According to a recent study by the University of Chicago, they have mentioned in one of their reports that the life expectancy overall in Pakistan, it is reduced by 2 years due to air pollution. But in Lahore, it is reduced to more than 5 years.
Is there the political will to try and find a solution and get the emissions down?
So certainly the Mondays are off for schools and offices, and hopefully that should reduce the commuting and the emissions. But in terms of the political will, yes, I think the government has the political will, but there are certain capacities which need to be built up. For example, the pollution control technologies which need to be implemented, and those are unfortunately lacking to a greater extent in Pakistan. So if we can improve the pollution control technologies, particularly when we talk about emissions from the industries, so if we have these filtration plants, electrostatic precipitators, as well as even scrubbers, they will make a huge difference in terms of the emissions. And then the other problem, the main problem is actually from the vehicles. So there are many vehicles which are very old. And if we can have controls for the emissions, if we can actually implement the existing legislation, that will bring a huge difference.
Dr. Asaf Khattak there. Now, capturing carbon dioxide and converting it to oxygen sounds like the perfect climate solution. And that's what the cultivation of microalgae can do. And now one company has managed to harness the process in order to create an award-winning carbon-negative drink.
Sarah, Christina and I first came across spirulina, which is a tiny blue-green algae, when we were researching food solutions to our climate crisis. We were determined to unlock the true human and climate health potential of spirulina. No arable land required, no fertilizers, pesticides, very limited fresh water, unlike a lot of other crops. But what we do use is the CO2 that we recycle from other industrial waste streams.
Do stay tuned, because coming up after the break, I'll be joined by climate scientist Dr. Gilbert and Anna Markova, the Policy Officer for Industry and Climate at the Trades Union Congress. We're going to be discussing what can be done to address the issue of climate change-induced migration and how seriously the UK government is taking the green transition. We'll see you in a couple of minutes.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region, hearing from people who have real stories.
I'll have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
There are still people inside the properties here.
They're coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. It was desperately sad, and the fact it was happening right in the heart of this community. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake might all be finished, I don't know.
Did you know if we use less energy, we can reduce air pollution? Like turning off the lights? Yep.
Storm Arwen will bring some disruption over the next few days. After a frosty start in the southeast, rain will clear across the south on Friday morning to leave a scattering of blustery showers. There'll be some winteriness on the hills. The wind will pick up in the north and west too. The afternoon will see more general rain, sleet and snow in the north, with severe coastal gales developing in the northeast. The clean northerly flow does mean that air pollution levels will remain low, with values of 2 or 3 on the daily air quality index.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with climate scientists Dr. Gilbert and Anna Markova, the Policy Officer for Industry and Climate at the TUC. Now, earlier on the show, we heard how climate change is forcing millions of people across the world to leave their homes and their livelihoods. It is fast becoming one of the main causes of forced migration, and the situation is likely to get much worse without urgent action. The UN Secretary-General has said climate change is now found to be the key factor accelerating all other drivers of forced displacement. So, Ella, given the urgency of this, what needs to be done?
Well, we need to make sure that the kinds of climate impacts which are driving people to either leave their homes within and move within their countries or to move internationally are addressed. And I mean, the primary thing that we need to do is make sure that this doesn't get any worse. And that means tackling climate change by reducing our emissions.
Anna, whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of richer nations to help those who are most vulnerable?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the key kind of principle to lay down is we all want to treat others how we expect to be treated. Everyone who experiences the loss of livelihood, everyone who experiences the loss of safety deserves, sanctuary if they're seeking sanctuary, and safety if they're seeking alternative livelihood. So, the countries that are experiencing the worst impact in terms of climate change, they're actually losing land, farmland, other resources, are the countries that have done the least to cause the global heating that we're experiencing. And the UK and other rich countries have the resources to fund the adaptation, have the resources to fund the sort of loss and damage that these countries have been requesting. So that's what we need to do. We've got the resources to do it, and the UK, particularly as it still holds the COP presidency, should use this moment really and its international influence and its resources to finance adaptation and loss and damage.
And Ella, it's not just an issue for poorer nations, is it? If you look at what's happening in Canada right now, you look to the US during hurricane season, the Australia wildfires, what we saw in Europe over the summer, those extreme weather events causing internal displacement. Is it surprising then that there isn't more urgency about this, more urgent action being taken?
When we put it like that, maybe it's surprising, but the fact of the matter is that if it doesn't affect us directly, or we don't think it affects us directly, we're more likely to ignore it and pretend it's not an issue. The thing is, it's going to affect all of us. It already affects all of us. Climate impacts are being felt here in the UK, they're being felt in Canada, they're being felt in the USA, they're being felt in the developing and developed world. And the fact is, it's going to get worse, especially if we do the little we're doing already to adapt and to mitigate climate change. The more warming we see in the future, the more devastating these impacts are going to become. And we absolutely have to do everything that we can to make sure that the worst impacts of climate change are avoided.
And what about those climate finance and adaptation pledges made at COP26 then, Anna? Are they going to make any difference?
Of course, every step makes a difference. And I think the acknowledgement that the issues of adaptation, loss and damage, just transition have had at COP26 are steps forward. But, so far, mostly it's words. So far, we have not seen anywhere near the amount of financing that the most affected countries are actually requesting. And the other thing is, one of the things that, I was in the Global Trade Union delegation at COP26, and one of the things that we were really calling for is that climate finance that money that rich countries put in to help poorer countries adapt or mitigate climate change, that those funds must be genuinely fit for purpose, that they must have safeguards to protect human rights, including indigenous rights, including women's rights, including labour rights. And that's not something that we've seen yet. So there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of the international negotiations, and even more work to be done in terms of securing the right amount of resource.
Let's move on to topic number 2. A campaign group paid to pollute has claimed that the UK government has given nearly £14 billion to oil and gas companies since the Paris Agreement was signed. Comes just weeks after COP26. Countries, including the UK, committed there to phasing down inefficient fuel subsidies as part of the Glasgow Climate Pact. Boris Johnson told world leaders they needed to match action to their promises on fighting climate change. But is his own government doing enough? Anna, the paid to pollute report out today is talking about, well, all talk and no action from the government. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so, and I particularly wanted to draw attention to one element of this report, of the estimates. So, the report says that there were £3.7 billion issued as new subsidies for decommissioning of oil and gas rigs. And what's happening at the moment is it's effectively kind of like dumping that money in the sea. The government is paying oil companies instead of the companies taking responsibility themselves. The government is paying oil companies to remove aging oil rigs. And a lot of the time, because of the way that this policy is set up, a lot of the time what ends up happening is they just end up getting towed away, let's say, and left on a beach in Bangladesh to sort of sit there and rust, or to be kind of recycled in a sort of informal economy with people getting paid poverty wages or less. So really, that money isn't fit for purpose. That policy isn't fit for purpose. We need something a lot better than that.
Ella, Boris Johnson talks about the UK building back greener, but this is going to take concerted and coordinated effort from all sectors. How do we ensure they have the climate leadership and know what to do in order to make that happen?
Well, I think it's true that we know already what we need to do. We need to dramatically change the way our economy is structured, and we need to change where our money is invested. And to be quite frank, the government is saying one thing and doing the complete opposite. The actions it's taking, investing in new oil fields or investing in new coal mines or subsidising fossil fuel companies or expanding airports, is completely counter to what they've promised as the president of the COP, and also after COP26, and it's completely inconsistent with all of their targets to meet under the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Pact. It's completely inconsistent, and what they actually need to be doing is withdrawing subsidies for fossil fuels, investing in cleaner, greener solutions, creating green jobs, and accelerating that transition to a society where we don't have to rely on these ancient, old technologies that aren't going to get us anywhere.
And Anna, what about on a more local level? Cities, businesses making net zero pledges too. How do they turn those into concrete action?
So absolutely, it's great to see that lots more businesses are pledging to reach net zero emissions by such and such a date, and same from towns, the same from regions. But from that, you need to build to an actual plan. And we've done our own polling a little while ago on kind of what the UK workforce thinks of how the green transition is being planned. And what we found was, yes, we all want to see that transition happening. And only 1 in 4 workers in the UK have said that they've had a chance to feed back to their employer on their ideas on what has to happen.
I'm really sorry to cut you off, Anna and Ella. We are out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Coming up next, Sky News is going to be live in Calais for a special programme on the deaths of 27 people trying to cross the English Channel. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.